as I speak, but just to say hello, my name is Phil Cohen. I'm the Research Director of Livingmaps Network. And I've been, amongst other things, I've been responsible for putting together this program of events, of webinars and lectures and workshops under the general title, Cartographies on the Front Line. Through all the events, we'll be exploring different aspects of the relationship, complicated relationship between war making and map making. Now this evening, I'm delighted that we've got three people who were coming at this from slightly different perspectives, but have all made a significant contribution to our understanding of that relationship. But before I introduce them, just a few kind of housekeeping things. So please do use the chat facility. If you point, we're going to take questions at the end of all the presentations. But you know, if you use the chat facility, then I'll make a note of the questions. You may want to actually say them live, but if not, I can bring them up in the Q&A. So please do use that facility. We've also we have a captions for people who are a bit hard of hearing. If they'd like to use that, you have to enable that if you want to use it. And also just to say that we are recording this, and that we'll be putting up an edited version of the the presentations and discussion on the Livingmaps website in due course. Right. So I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to introduce the first speaker, and then we'll have the presentation, and then the second speaker, and so on. So our first speaker is Jeremy Black. I think some of you may know his work. He's a military, diplomatic, and cartographic historian, and he's written a lot of books. I think over 100, in fact, on a wide range of related topics. His most recent publication is relevant to his talk tonight. Are in 2015, Metropolis, Mapping the City. And then in 2020, he wrote a book on military strategy. And 2 years after that, on geographies of war. And he's on the editorial board of History Today, the International History Review, Journal of Military History, and he's the editor of Archives. So you can see he's a very busy man. And we're delighted that he could find time to come and talk to us today. He's given us, I think, a rather intriguing title, A Short History of War Maps in 20 Minutes. So, Jeremy, you've got 20 minutes. And you need to unmute. You need to unmute.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for taking part. And may I congratulate Phil on organising this. I think that's a very good idea, and these kind of meetings, interdisciplinary meetings, I think are important. It's often struck me that we all in our own way think and live in silos as scholars, whether those silos are thematic or national, chronological, or whatever. And it's therefore the case that if one's dealing with a sort of protean phenomenon, war, which is as important as it is unattractive, there is a terrible danger that one approaches it in terms of some kind of unitary set of characteristics. And in doing so, one tends to endow it with a specific chronology, pattern of development, and context, whether social or ideological. And what a surprise, that process very much reflects present day values. It also can be extraordinarily partial. By the nature of things, most people who think about war when they're considering it tend to think about the leading powers in the international system and not the most typical ones. They tend to think about the United States or China or Russia and not Paraguay or Peru or Madagascar. And that is true not only of how we look at war today, it's also true of how we look at military history and assemble its chronology. On top of that, there is a tendency, a very serious tendency, to downplay the extent and significance of civil warfare, unless that is it's in the form of regular armed forces, as in the case of the English or American civil wars, and instead to focus on international wars, which is again slightly bizarre, because if you think about it, the continent which has seen the least, apart from Antarctica, the least, its powers have been least engaged in international war since 1935 is Latin America, particularly South America, and yet, as listeners will know, South American governments can be bellicose, but that bellicosity, often a matter of military rule, tends to be directed at fellow citizens rather than those of other countries. So in other words, what I'm essentially saying is there is a very crude and simplistic account of war out there, and the danger for that is that if you're then speaking up about mapping, you end up with a very crude and simplistic account of military mapping. We can take that a stage further. If what you want to look at is the conduct of war, most specialists would divide that into three categories, three levels, if you like: tactical, operational, and strategic. And as you might anticipate, those have different requirements for a cartographic, or should I say spatial awareness. And I underline that difference because most spatial awareness does not lead to cartography. If I say to you, we have to move and take that building, and I suggest you go round taking advantage of that woodland over there, I don't need to draw a map of it. And indeed, at the tactical level more generally, the nature of the mapping of war has been relatively contingent and relatively recent, because, as you would not be surprised to hear, most units do not know where they are going to engage an opponent, and any map that might be available is unlikely to be of the relevant location or scale or convenience. So there is this tendency to downplay the spatial sense, which is, in my view, the most significant element, and what I would call mental mapping. And I would argue that most of the mapping of war, indeed, I would say most mapping, is a mental process, and that cartography as conventionally understood, whether we are looking at cartography in the European tradition or the Chinese tradition, or looking for other traditions, cartography as conventionally understood actually only gives us a slight insight into that. And clearly, if you are looking more at the operational level of war, which involves a higher level, doesn't mean a better level, I'm not making any moral comment here, a higher level of planning, on even more the strategic level, then you would tend to seek a more defined spatial program in which maps are more useful. And as you will know, you can write about that relatively easily. You can talk about geopolitics or strategy existing for periods prior to the use of the term. Strategy, is conventionally understood, is a late 18th century term in the Western tradition. Geopolitics, a very late 20th century term. But that doesn't mean that strategy and geopolitics did not exist prior to the term. And again, as with spatiality, we have to be very careful of what we're looking at. And then, having suggested these three levels, one could add the three types of, as it were, environment of war: the land, the sea, and the air. We're talking about fundamental environments in which clearly the nature of the spatial requirement varies. If you're taking part, for instance, in an amphibious operation at the land-sea interchange, it is appropriate that you know where that interchange is and that you have some sense of where there should be shoals and where, conversely, there may well be beaches from which you can land troops. or oppose a landing of troops. If you're dealing with air warfare, you have a very different nature of three-dimensional spatiality, one that in many senses is best presented in computer programs rather than anything that you might try and fix in 2 dimensions. So partly what we have is, if you like, a fitness for purpose or needs-based idea of the relationship between spatiality and war, in which you are varying in terms of the particular requirements of weapon systems. So, for example, ballistics in some respects is a process of spatiality, with the diagrams of ballistics the equivalent of the map for that gun or the map for gunnery. You might not see a map in that term, but then a lot of people have a very rigid sense of maps, and maps are in many senses diagrams of spatial awareness and spatial use, and they don't have to be what we might conventionally see as territorial or geographical. We then also have, and I think the other 2 speakers are going to address much more this, so I do not wish to in any way rush in on their ground, but we then also have notions of the social, cultural, and in some cases religious or ethnic dimensions of conflict, which you might or might not address as warfare. Those are all very important, and they're particularly important when one is looking for causes and consequences. Again, my colleagues will be talking about that, but the way in which one can take that spatiality and understand it and in some terms use it is one that is not necessarily easy to discuss, not least because often the assumptions that people have, for example, at the location of ethnic groups, may well be deeply flawed or indeed ridiculous, in the sense you take, for example, the idea that people are clearly segregated into ethnicities bears absolutely no relationship to the fact that in the past, as in the present day, there are many people of mixed ethnic or religious backgrounds, or who have prime other motivations. So in other words, what might be the mental map of a protagonist may not be, and they can then make a physical map of that, may not be an accurate depiction of the situation, although that doesn't prevent it helping to activate their activity, and indeed in some cases the animosities that rest in it. So what I'm trying to do is to say, and I'm nearly using up my time, is to say that to me, discussion of mapping is important precisely because of what I've been trying to hint at and what listeners could do much better, which is that mapping involves fundamental conceptual and methodological questions about not only aspects of existence, but also about the intellectual ways in which human beings engage with them, both as rational and as emotional creatures, however much you might think that there is an accurate dichotomy of rational and emotional. War focuses that because it brings out the institutional commitment to actually producing a certain set of outcomes, because it focuses public engagement and interest at the time, and because it is consequential. But the actual intellectual questions bound up in war are not limited to it, but relate in many senses to how we understand reality, with the map both a way to present reality and a way to interrogate it. Thank you. Sorry, I can't hear you, sorry.
Thank you so much.
I can't hear you either.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was a wonderful way to start, actually. You've raised some very general but also very prescient points, both about the nature of war and how we perceive it, and also the role of different kinds of mapping. And I'm sure that there'll be quite a few people want to ask questions and whatever. So let me just emphasize again, please use the chat facility if you want to log a question or a point of information, and we'll return to that at the end. So our next speaker is Heather Ashley Hayes, and her talk is again rather enticingly entitled "Where the Map Breathes." So I think we've already got a sense that mapping is going to be approached from what I would call a rather left field standpoint. Heather's work has really combined theory and practice. She's the author of a book called Violent Subjects and Rhetorical Cartography in the Terror Wars, and that was really about rhetoric and violence in the post 9/11 society, looking through the lens of cartography. And she's currently working on her second book, Struggle Mapping the New Resistance, which is looking really at the intersection, the way in which sort of the strategies of state surveillance and violence impact on everyday life, and on particularly on vulnerable communities on the front lines of various situations of conflict. So I think without further ado, I'll hand over to Heather to find out how the map breathes.
Thank you so much. So first of all, can everyone hear me okay? Phil, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. I appreciate it. I want to start off by thanking Phil so much, thanking all of the Living Maps Collective for this invitation today. Thank you to Jeremy and Michael for sharing space. Speaking of living maps, being able to connect together across the borders that divide us, and sharing their work. And everyone who's on the call today, I appreciate you being here. I appreciate very much the opportunity to be together, discuss this work. And I look forward to your questions and to the conversation afterward. As a note, I have a few slides. I'll move between my words and you seeing me and a few of those slides. So I'll share my screen a few times over the talk, and I'll sort of alert you as I'm going to be doing that. So as critical geographers, Derek Gregory and Alan Pred have noted, terror and torture are really no longer the exclusive property of distant others, but they inhabit the central structures of our own societies as well. They extend far beyond the outer layers of political and military power. For me, this points to the pervasive intimacy of terror, of fear, of violence in the modern war state, and more importantly, the contemporary world in which all of us live. Warfare and political violence have long targeted technological support systems of cities. During World War II, bombing planners evolved complex ways to destroy transportation systems and water infrastructures. As Stephen Graham notes, modern war is increasingly focused on degrading and contra-functioning the infrastructure that makes our everyday life possible. I argue this is mainly manifest in two ways: threats of interruption and occupation. Interruption comes in the form of, you probably have felt this, the blackout, the gridlock, severed connectivity, gas shortages, networks are down and unavailable. Efforts that in an instant can render vast edifices of infrastructure in everyday life useless concrete and wires. Improvisation, repair, finding alternative means of being warm, drinking water, staying safe, eating, moving around, contacting our loved ones, and disposing of waste become the imperatives of everyday life in the Anthropocene during these interruptions. The second, occupation, comes in the form of physical realignments of public and sometimes even private spaces. Surveillance camera installations throughout our public parks and neighborhoods, safe watch rotations, the broken windows policing tactics that flood communities with weaponized law enforcement presences, unprecedented funding to decommission military-grade weaponry into city policing, institutional safety checkpoints and programs that require increased security presence in everyday systems like city government, schools, and airports. American rapper T.I. describes this cartography in his hit track from 2016, War Zone. We're living in a war zone, but you don't notice you're living in it. Before he repeats 4 times the now infamous community rally cry, born in Black communities across the United States since the 2014 police killing of Mr. Eric Garner in New York. Hands up, can't breathe. In my talk today, I hope to explore the imaginative geographies through which political and social violence works. As a scholar grounded in rhetorical studies with a background in race and ethnic studies, as well as cultural anthropology, my work has always argued the ways that images and words, which is to say symbols, hold enormous power. Their dissemination, or for that matter, suppression, can have the most acutely material consequences. My work also comes from the materialist tradition of rhetoric and communication, one that understands symbolic practices of locational position, naming, the paper maps that we once held before Google came around, and public memorialization, for example, but also one that pursues work on a material level by locating our bodies within everyday landscapes of communities, cities, systems, and spaces. If you may indulge me, living maps. Here, I am interested in the binding between power, politics, and the production of public spheres, both global and domestic in the communities in which I work, through which we may confront or understand disproportionate violence of the state against those living in precarity, most often people of color, women, queer and trans communities, indigenous people, poor and impoverished communities, including those that we frequently understand as living in the global South. This is a world where the battleground is no longer just land, though it is still land. Rather, it is space itself. It is our bodies. It is the cartography of the space and the bodies that move through it. While spectacular displays of death and violence are now made possible by modern war technology, there is an intimate and personal terror in our contemporary world, vividly present in the everyday lives of people, that is not an accidental side effect of war, but rather a calculated strategy of the contemporary military machine. In other words, it's doing exactly what it's been built to do. Often, this means reducing civilian population, and sometimes soldiers, to their barest forms of life, just as effectively as if it had made them direct targets of the spectacular military violence that are more often memorialized in Hollywood cinema or epic war novels. So I suggest that terror and torture have become not the exclusive property of others, but rather now flow through our everyday structures of society, extending beyond the scope of military power. To help us think about these ideas today, I look specifically at communicative technologies woven into modern cartography. Hostile architecture projects in urban landscape design that depend on both design and facial recognition. I hope to offer new theoretical insights that read these technologies onto geography, space, and the body for the way they produce intimate strategies of terror and fear as effectively as making those populations direct targets of spectacular military war fighting like bombs. I will then close by turning to resistive cartographies that embrace visuality, narrative, and technological disruption to help dislocate racialized, gendered, and class-based structural violences. These disruptions, I believe, are part of a larger resistance project to manifest an unpoliced public space, openings that may function as the lungs of a geography, a space where people may go to breathe, to relax, to reflect, and to be. As architectural historian Paul Hurst notes, when writing a history of fortification as form of architecture, symbols affect the capacity of soldier and citizen alike to endure suffering. They generate a dreamscape through which we comprehend war, both in terms of conduct, like bravery, endurance, competence, resistance, victory, defeat, who won, who lost, but also in terms of how we place ourselves within the world, knowing where we stand and why. Buildings may not narrate landscapes in this way, but they function to both structure our ideas of what war and conflict is, as well as to generate the symbolic order in which we place ourselves when we think about war, as well as violence and defense. Imagine the example of a classic pre-modern staple of warfighting, the castle. A moat around it with dangerous things either swimming in it or sticking out of it, sharp weapons protruding from its outer walls, a heavily fortified outer wall, which also is much higher than would be reasonable for anyone to climb with an assurance of safety. You can envision the small notches at the top built every few yards or more, from which at any time a soldier may emerge in armor, holding another form of a weapon or just surveilling the area. An enemy would need to evade that watch. Brave is the person who would attempt to scale those walls or interact with these weapons, and defeated is the enemy who stormed these walls to no avail. Yet also entire communities around the land position themselves in relation to those castles, subjects of the castle's inhabitants. There was no need for the inhabitant to be an actual king. As Hearst notes, simply placing or building a castle and fortifying it created the embodied equivalent of marking one's power over the area and the people. It was not uncommon, in fact, quite the opposite, for those who owned a castle or built a castle to ransack the land and goods of others many kilometers away. The fortification, the space, all of it was a clear alert of how bodies living in the landscape should understand themselves in relation to power, whether there was a war on or not. And importantly, in this early modern fortification, as reflected in the immense amounts of digging, fortress assembly, the prolific use of sharp spikes and rocks against enemies, and the creation of other even more ephemeral structures, the landscapes of war were designed more to make the cartography hostile to enemies and citizens than to facilitate any direct fighting, as we often imagine in the contemporary war state. In other words, hostile architecture has not remade an idea of war, but rather genealogically reshaped it in ways consistent with its origins, while integrating modern technology into its arsenal. Now, this requires me to pause. Wait, what's hostile architecture? Well, generally, it's traced back to 1972, when an American city planner, Oscar Newman, published a book, Design Guides for Creating Defensible Space, pointing out something that mayors were asking lots of questions about. Why did higher crime rates exist in a high-rise housing project than in low-rise complexes? Newman argued the reason was not because the residents had an inherent propensity toward crime, but because they felt no responsibility for their area and no control over their space in high rises. As such, he introduced the idea of defensible space, which he said would be a built environment on a map whose physical characteristics would function to allow the inhabitants to become key agents in ensuring their own security. Defensible space would have 5 characteristics: territoriality, or the idea that one's home is sacred to them, privatized. 2, natural surveillance, a link between one's own physical space and their ability to see everything around them, surveillance. 3, image, the capacity of physical design to impart a sense of security to anyone who moves through it, so protection. 4, milieu, of any feature that may affect security, such as proximity to military spaces, police substations, or busy commercial areas. And finally, control. For better security, residents should have more control over their ability to surveil spaces and the adjoining areas to their spaces. But the real shift in space came when criminologist C. Ray Jeffrey, who worked for the federal government, launched the Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design movement. Backed by millions of federal and state dollars in 1975, he expanded Newman's ideas and a cartographic design took off. He reshaped cities across the United States from Washington, D.C. to Chicago, to Seattle, to Los Angeles. Washington, D.C. think tanks sold the ideas to London, to Tokyo, and to other cities around the world, all based on 3 core principles. 1, design the placement of physical features, activities, and the movement of people in such a way as to maximize visibility of the space and its users. That will foster positive social interaction among and this is key, legitimate users of public space. So potential illegitimate users and offenders will feel increased scrutiny and thus will perceive an increase in risk. In other words, they'll go away and not commit crime. 2, selectively place entrance, exits, fencing, lighting, and landscapes to limit or control the flow of people through it. Again, favor those who are legitimate. And 3rd, territorial reinforcement will promote social control, policing, through increased defining of public space and proprietary concern. In other words, promote a sense of ownership, and what is not privately owned, make sure you police. Some surmise that Jeffrey's position was so quickly adopted across all the political parties in the US and quickly across Europe as well, because it argued that crime and vandalism were not inevitable ways of life among marginalized groups, particularly immigrants, Black and brown people, and people living in poverty, but were due to poor design, bad cartographies. It's from this history that hostile, sometimes called defensive, architecture emerged. You have likely experienced or at least seen hostile architecture in your city. I'm going to share my screen for a moment.
This makes you feel dumb. Know that I know.
Spikes that evade or keep skateboarders from skating on surfaces that look much like these, which are in Chicago. Space positioning that keeps benches from being slept on or being sat on from sort of more than one person at a time. So this is to keep houseless individuals from laying down for long periods of time, but also keep senior citizens from resting on these spaces. That can also look like this, where there's actual physical spaces cut out of benches. It can look like this, where spikes are placed in spaces where individuals sleep, individuals sit, so no one can sort of sit in these spaces or lay in these spaces. And that can get much more aggressive, where you see actual pointed sort of hostile spikes placed in areas that look just like this. And then you see the remnants of fencing that has spikes at the top, and that looks a little bit like this. So most likely you've experienced or seen that in any city you've moved through, or perhaps the city that you live in. Okay. Great. Here, it might be helpful to take a closer look at how one city in particular has built a new hostile cartography in this model. I live in Portland, Oregon, in the United States, a much smaller city than New York, Los Angeles, London, Tokyo. And don't get me wrong, hostile architecture is prolific throughout the United States, Europe, all over the world. More than 472 global cities have invested more than $5 billion on this design approach just since 2016. Remapping entire networks of space and city areas. It's expensive. Portland, Oregon has spent more than $1.3 million in city funding on hostile architecture just since 2019, all directed at evacuating houseless populations from public space. In Portland, there are around 7,000 houseless people that can be counted, at least as of the last point in time count, which was early 2022. 40% of them are people of color, and 89% live below what is considered extreme poverty in the United States. Communication scholar Barry Brummett argues there's something different between a discrete and a diffuse text. A discrete text has a clear boundary in time and space. Imagine a speech. It begins and then it ends. Diffuse texts, on the other hand, have perimeters that are not so clear. They're mixed up with other signs. We move in and out of them, they circulate and they extend. Suffice it to say, cartographies are diffuse in this way. Hostile architecture, as what I've cataloged in Portland and so many other cities have weaponized against their communities, contributes in this way to what I would call an experiential landscape. It is made up of both physical and cognitive features. From the photos I've just shown, the physical features are clear. The cognitive features sometimes less so. As we experience in hostile architecture, we both activate the full range of memorialized images we have of space and a place. In other words, imagine everything you've ever learned about a city, movies, books, what you've been told about it, what you can imagine. But also, we record the ways that space and place interacts with our bodies as we move through it. Take trains, take cabs, Ubers, Lyfts, attend the movies, attend theaters, and go through a space. We catalog the intimate terrors and violences that we can encounter, whether we interact with them directly or not. Victor Bergen calls this the way a city is experienced as a physically built environment, but also recorded in, whether it be novels, films, photographs, television, comic strips, or so on. It's both a city physically around us and in our imagination, how we see it, remember it, and how it's marked within and through our psychological state, our public memories, our personal fears and relationships to the state apparatus. I'll move again to share my screen. In this sense, if you look at some of the examples in Portland, there are places where houseless people used to be able to find refuge and safety. This is one of them. They could sleep there, they could gather there, they could talk there, exchange food there. This is what it looks like now. Any of us, assuming we're fully able-bodied, would barely be able to walk there across it, even in good hiking shoes and with a hiking stick. You can also note spaces like this, where an individual can no longer sleep, but still tries to, and is left with the psychic impression of not only how it feels to sit there, but the memory of what the space used to be when they were able to sleep there. This bench is one of my favorite examples because it exists at an intersection right across from a 7-Eleven, which looks innocuous enough until you note what that machine looks like. That machine is a piece of hostile architecture that when enough houseless people gather on the bench that you just saw, it begins to emanate a loud noise designed to make them flee. So not only can they no longer sleep on the benches, but the 7-Eleven occupants or police from the station down the street can make that emanate loud sounds that will then be marked on the sort of psychic imaginary of those who attempt to sit on the bench across the street to find respite. In this sense, experiential landscapes offer fully embodied subject positions that direct our ways of experiencing the world, our ways of looking, whether we're seeking refuge in the spaces that used to be unhostile and now are or not. They generate our ways of knowing, how we think about both our spaces and how we think about each other. These spaces are thus able to stage the conditions of production for the new war machine's current iteration. The built environment's brutality is combined with its impact on humans' ongoing relationship to their own bodies, which is to say their own labor, which is to say their own existence. Public space is supposed to be our commons, what philosophers Hart and Negri refer to as a combination of the natural environment, its resources and products it yields, and the products of social interaction, our codes, our language, our affects and emotional connection to one another, shared information and forms of knowledge. Especially in this second form, our sense of the common is wholly immanent to biopolitical practices. By this, I mean our bodies moving through public and shared spaces, a common wealth we share together, constantly being produced and circulated in the processes by which life itself is sustained. In areas as diverse as our shared labor, our healthcare, our housing, our education, our research, the arts. This all escapes from what Angela Davis has termed the racial capitalism of the global war machine. Young skateboarders, senior citizens, mothers with strollers, drag queens, punk rockers, hip hoppers, jocks, and revolutionaries, everyone together, anonymous community in shared spaces. And by space, I mean public common space, crossing paths. Hostile architecture combined with its cousin technological surveillance machines is erected to control these problems. By this, I mean people's bodies. And by this, I mean us, those coded by the war machine as possible threats. This erosion and privatization of space becomes warfare, where both space and bodies in this cartography are the battleground. Wresting space from the public and bodies of those who inhabit them are the struggles. Where gathering together to engage in public acts of community, sometimes known as democracy or even diplomacy, is criminalized as loitering. As poet Ross Gay notes, one of the synonyms for loitering is taking one's time. The crime of loitering, the idea of it is about ownership of one's time, which must be sometimes wrested away from the assumed owners of it, who are not you, back to the rightful owner who is. The same is true here about the body, and above all, about the cartographies of space in which our bodies may exist.
That's good.
Thank you so much, Heather, for that. Well, it was certainly, I'm going to say we went round the houses, but you know, it covered a lot of ground, and exploring the relationship between material and symbolic violence in a very kind of graphic and pointed way. I mean, in terms of, for example, what's happening in China right now, and not to mention what's happening in Ukraine. So, I mean, I think, yeah, there's a lot of things that we can draw on in the discussion, I think, from your presentation. So thank you so much for that. Now, so our final presenter this evening is Michael Shapiro, and he's going to be drawing on his research. And it's interesting, you know, following up really from Heather's presentation. He's going to be drawing on his research into the violent event space that kind of configures the shifting borderlands between Israel and Palestine, is using that as a kind of case study in how the cartographic imagination is mobilized in constructing architectures of occupation and resistance. And actually, this is a theme I think we're going to be taking up also in a later event, I think in February, with forensic architecture. So I'm really looking forward to Michael's presentation. I should say that he's written, I mean, he's not only written about his book Cartographies of Violence, Mapping Cultures of War, but he's written on a number of other topics, including aesthetics of equality. He's written a book called Writing Politics, and he's also interested in the relationship between art and politics. He's written a book about that. So let me hand over to Michael. If you can unmute yourself, Michael.
Yes, thank you, Phil.
Over to you.
Thanks very much for inviting me. I have obviously a lot of very good acts to follow. There are tough ones. Thank you very much for those stimulating presentations. I'm actually going to begin, before I talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the cartographic dimensions of it, a literary analysis that I do of in the Czech Republic. While I was in the Czech Republic on sabbatical, I ended up reading a lot of Czech novels, and literary cartographies have interested me for quite some time, ever since I read the Atlas of the European Novel by Franco Moretti, which I picked up in a bookstore in the UK, in fact. And what fascinated me especially was the way in which he pointed out how small the UK was in the novels of Jane Austen, which focused on a marriage market, as opposed to historical novels like Sir Walter Scott, which did an analysis of the borders. In any case, this particular cartographic analysis deals with what I call Czech connections. It's a chapter in my book on writing politics that emerged from my stay in Prague. I begin with Laurent Binet's well-known novel now, HHHH, Himmler's Herrn heißt Heydrich, Himmler's brain is named Heydrich, which deals with the protectorate in Prague. The cartographic emphasis of Binet's novel about the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich is geopolitical. It's focused on the Nazi justification for annexing Czechoslovakia's national space. Insofar as Prague's urban space is part of the novel's literary geography, the reference include Heydrich's habitual route, which created the opportunity for his assassins, and the assassin's subsequent escape route and hiding place in the cathedral where they were killed after the hiding place was betrayed. In contrast with another novel that I talk about in the chapter, Yuri Weil's literary geography and his novel Life with a Star is a more extensive map of Prague, emphasizing the incessantly expanding prohibitions constraining the Jewish population's use of space, both outside, throughout the city, and even in their own private dwellings. In Weil's novel, rather than a mere background, Prague's architecture and urban map are narrative elements. To situate the effects of the changes to Prague wrought by the protectorate, one has to appreciate the way the organization of urban space affects everyday life. As I've put it elsewhere, quote, To locate the way in which the design of urban space is actualized in everyday life in the cities of the world, three functions stand out. The first involves dwelling, the second seeing, and the third moving. When I made that observation in 2013 while trying to navigate a city with which I was unfamiliar, this was Prague earlier, my intent was transpersonal, an attempt to situate the topological implications of public protests. It follows, I wrote, that to violate the everyday phenomenology in which these three functions are being rearticulated is to engage in an exemplary act of politicization. It is to create what Jacques Rancière refers to a repartitioning, or a change in the way the political is partitioned from the non-political. In the case of Prague under the Protectorate, the topological changes, which included removal of certain iconic statues, for example, the Jewish composer Felix Mendelssohn. Weil has a novel called Mendelssohn on the Roof, and there's a lot of irony in that, because when the Nazis wanted to remove the statue, they couldn't figure out which one was Mendelssohn. Even local rabbis were unable to identify who it was. And also, ironically, although he had a Jewish heritage, Mendelssohn was in fact a Protestant. But anyway, that had an opposite intention. Instead of enabling and expanding political life for previously uninvolved subjects, the aim was the disqualification of the presence of Prague's Jewish population. Jews were barred from most bars and restaurants. The novel registers the changes by narrating the protagonist Joseph Rubacek's experience from his first-person point of view of a loss of control of his own living quarters and an increasingly curtailed ability to move about the city and use public accommodations. Now I want to turn to a different contrast. In contrast to the restrictions levied on Prague's Jews during the Holocaust, I want to deal with the way in which the Israeli state levies restrictions on Palestinians. This is a section from my book called Punctuations, How the Arts Think the Political. This is from the chapter on architectural punctuations, which is very much inspired by the thinking of Bernard Tschumi, who regards a building as an event space. The controversies surrounding architecture and the long-standing Israeli-Palestinian conflict have asserted themselves within clashing cartographic histories and between the geopolitical and the sacred. The crux of that clash became apparent in September 1996, when a violent conflict ensued after the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu opened a new gate to the ancient tunnel that connected the Israeli sector by the Western Wall, passing under the Aqsa Mosque into the Muslim section of the city. Reviewing that episode and looking into the interpretive practices through which architecture has been presumed to present itself as a political reality, Daniel Monk analyzes what he refers to as the career of architecture in the prehistory of the present conflict, while at the same time questioning the normative presentations of architecture's political self-certainty. Certainly, monumental architecture is central to the conflicting allegiances of the region, inclining Monk to characterize the Israeli occupation as aesthetic and to investigate the interpretation-mediated career of architecture that has been continually featured in the accounts of the conflict, even though reliance on such concrete appearances is sometimes misleading. Although architecture remains an active force in the conflict, it now has a different modality and an undeniable effectivity. The architectural history that postdates the career to which Monk refers involves a dialectic of violence, featuring encounters between the forces of occupation and securitization mounted by the IDF, the Israeli military, and Palestinian resistance. Quite apart from the loosely integrated violent tactics of various Palestinian commando forces, a resistance involving spatio-temporal ingenuity has been underway since the period of Israeli separation wall, whose construction was completed in 2006. The wall, on a series of checkpoints, radically partitioned Palestinian territories structurally and temporally, imposing difficult travel restrictions within Palestinian territories as well as between them and Israel. That violent architectural imposition has had the effect of rigidifying what had been for decades a frontier with a more elastic morphology. Israel's passive geometry of separation, the wall and checkpoints, has been supplemented with a more active geometry, a set of search and destroy tactics, which Eyal Weissman describes elaborately after a set of ethnographic interviews with Israeli forces. For example, during the 2002 Israeli attack on the West Bank city of Nablus, he learns from the Israeli commander Aviv Kochavi that the army's tactics involved an inverse geometry, defined as the reorganization of the urban syntax by means of a series of micro-tactical actions in which soldiers avoided the streets, roads, and alleyways and courtyards that define the logic of movement through the city, as well as the external doors, internal stairways, and windows that constitute the order of the buildings. Rather, they were punching holes through partly walls, ceilings, and floors, and moving across them through 2,100 meters of pathways of domestic interior, hollowed out by the dense and continuous city fabric. Given the overwhelming destructive capacity of the Israeli Air Force, along with the destructive tactics of the military on the ground, the armed Palestinian resistance has been forced underground, so much so that much of the economy of Gaza has resulted from the tunnel building by private contractors. An encounter of cartographies characterizes the way that Palestinians regain mobility to make life livable in response to the architectural evidence they face. One map drawn up and used by the Israeli military is one that has ordered the Israeli strategies of isolation, incursion, and destruction on the ground and from the air. The Palestinian cartographic response is both structural and temporal. Structurally, it has sought to restore some of the elasticity that the wall system and the checkpoints has effaced. As the Palestinian architect Yara Sharif puts it, the design problem involves the creation of a more elastic space born from the will to connect, a space of resistance that keeps on changing with the interventions that respond to an imposed instability through the tactics of an emerging architecture with its nature, which nature might seem ephemeral, yet it's quickly its effect. Employing Henri Lefebvre's concept of counter spaces, Sharif refers to the need to step above and underneath the exhausted surface of Palestine, to evade the way Israelis are eating away slowly and quietly at the Palestinian landscape. She points out that as the occupation set of checkpoints divide Palestinians from each other, the Palestinians refigure the spaces around them. They're transformed by the everyday behavior to try to create spaces of possibility, playing with lines on the map that created new lines. Palestine is no longer the city and the village, it is also the in-between, the dead spaces and the margins in which people perform, wait, remember, and resist. It's the new route that its people create, the tunnels we dig under the walls and the sewage pipes we walk through every day. Throughout such counter mapping and refiguring, Palestine becomes a resistant event space, as in Sharif's terms, non-spaces are being made in everyday life into the real spaces. Sharif thus effectively conveys the way Palestinians have met the architecture of occupation with a counter-architecture, which involves, among other things, redesigns that create possibilities of mobility that the separation wall and checkpoints stymie. The countering of the Israeli-controlled opening and closing of border gates, opens at 7 a.m. and closes at 7 p.m., requires temporal design strategies. For example, unable to move effectively within the complicated lines that define spatial temporal rhythms of the occupation, young Palestinians looking for job opportunities within Israel have to use the darkness and various hidden spaces, which they refer to as rabbit holes. Meeting usually at 2 or 3 in the morning, groups of young men gather at agreed points and sneak through together to reach the outer wall. Ultimately, through such tactics, which, as Michel de Certeau famously points out, involves the use of time by people who cannot control space, Palestinians activate micro-space events to transform the border areas into an alternative event space. I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
So, thank you very much, Michael. That's a really interesting account really of that particular kind of set of borderlands and the relationship between, you know, the official cartographies of violence and how the Palestinians are kind of recreating, reinventing in a way their environment as a form of resistance. We've had three very rich presentations, and I feel a bit like a DJ. I'm having to find some kind of points of connection or segue between the three presentations. But while people are collecting their thoughts and hopefully using the chat facility for that purpose, we've got one or two already have done that. But can I encourage you to do that more, or just when we come to it, just basically come out and say whatever it is you want to say. But there were just a couple of things that did occur to me while our three speakers were making their presentations. I mean, one was actually something that they didn't actually any of them directly refer to. So I'll address this question to all three of you. I mean, there are different ways of defining terror, but it is a set of practices which are systematically arbitrary and also arbitrarily systematic. And as such, they are unmappable. And I just wondered if you'd, from your different perspectives and your different bases of research, had thought about this relationship between terror and the unmappable, and what implications that has for strategies of resisting terror, actually.
Can I make a suggestion? And I ought to mention I'm not a religious person for a second. I think one of the points is that in a way we discuss cartography as a secular project, and which is fine, that's how I think of it. But for people of a sort of messianic disposition, I'm not sure that this idea of our sense of cartography captures the ability of, as it were, providential force to move between and through dimensions. So if you think about it, for most of human existence, a way in which providence has been thought about is one in which it can span conventional divides. I mean, I've recently been writing a book about the Gothic novel, and in the Gothic novel, you get that all the time. So I'm not sure that our way of looking at things necessarily captures how terror is conceived of by those who wish to use it.
Okay. Heather or Michael, have you any thoughts on this?
Yes. Yes, actually, I have a structural analysis involved with that kind of terror. I'm especially interested in the way in which the design of cities to facilitate automobility has crushed people's ability to move about. It's a structurally oriented, slow-moving kind of terror. One of the places where I analyze it is in a chapter I recently wrote on the film Caché, in which the victims in the particular story are the only ones who are in automobiles under coercion, whereas everybody else is able to move about freely. And in a new essay that I'm working on, I'm doing an analysis of the opening sections of the film Midnight Cowboy, where Dustin Hoffman, known as Ratso Rizzo, is trying to walk across the street. And he threads his way through automobiles because the city has now been designed not for pedestrians, but for cars. And he's being threatened with honking horns. And he says in his Bronx accent, "Hey, I'm walking here. I'm walking here," right? He tries to assert his resistance to the structural imposition that automobility has created. And yet one other analysis, which is my section on Latinx presence in urban life, I talk about the way in which Boyle Heights in Los Angeles has been shut down basically by redesign of the city for automobility, as opposed to what Ivan Illich famously refers to as conviviality, which had a lot to do with the structure of Latinx living space. I'll stop there for the moment.
Heather, have you got any thoughts you'd like to share with us?
I think it's a provocative question. The idea of what's the relationship between terror and the unmappable, and what implication does that have for strategies of resistance? And so I guess I think there's two underlying questions that we need to answer before addressing that, which is, what does mapping mean, and what are we talking about when we're talking about terror? And so I think, in terms of my research and how I look at this, I think terror is a multifaceted project, or, as we might say, a multi-headed hydra, right? And so I think in my first book, I talk about projects of terror that I think, we widely talk about when we talk about the terror wars, so to speak, right? So I look specifically at the use of, for example, military grade drones. I look at the use of military grade bombs, those sorts of things. But, I'm suggesting in this work and in the book I'm working on now that I think there's also terror can also be understood as something much more intimate, as much more personal, as much more everyday, that's working on physical spaces, that's working on the body, and that's working on sort of the psyche of those that are experiencing it. So if that's how we understand, that's how I'm understanding, sort of thinking about terror, then we think about, okay, now what's the relationship between terror and the unmappable? Well, we could say something like the body is unmappable, although I think there's some, who have written about the body who might disagree, although it requires a different understanding, new understandings of what maps mean, right? I think the same is true, though, to talk about space, because we can think about maps and space, and we have some understandings of what mapping means, which is, the idea of borders and boundaries, and, as I talk about in the talk, paper maps. But there's also the idea of mapping in space that has to do with, like I say, kind of experiential landscapes, how we come to understand, a cartography through, Hollywood film. I mean, I appreciate the answer that Michael just gave, right? The idea of Hollywood film, the idea of, news accounts, the idea of, the symbolic order sort of brings us to understand spaces and cartographies in particular ways. I mean, Israel-Palestine is a phenomenal example. In fact, that's how most people understand it, having been someone who did field work in Palestinian territories in 2016, 2018, right? Most people do not understand that conflict from, the livable spaces or the drawn maps of that area. So then getting to what's the implication that has for strategies of resistance, at least in my work, I would suggest that if we sort of open the aperture for how we think about what mapping means and open the aperture for the ways we see what to me seems plainly sort of materially happening, which is the terror apparatus and the war apparatus expanding the ways it works on space and works on the body, that then has the implication that strategies of resistance, evolve, which they're doing, right? That's happening, and whether it be the US, the UK, or, what we understand, and we can talk about this language, but the global South. So I think that's part of the implication that has for strategies of resistance, which is people learn new ways of resistance. They enact and embody new ways of resistance against the terror state and against the war machine.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps at a later point, we might think a bit about the pandemic and the creation of phobic spaces, but that's anyway another conversation. We've got a couple of questions, relevant questions here, following on from that. One from Sana Murani. Hi Sana, where you are? Do you want to say it, or you want to unmute yourself? Yeah.
Thanks, Phil. No, just really to mention it again, because there has been the three speakers spoke about it from different perspectives, and I'm just kind of interested in where do you situate mappings within a mapping around war and conflict or violence? Is it with the people who are affected by it, or is it with the researcher who's doing the work? So I'm kind of interested in this relationship between the two, I suppose.
Your own work has been actually with people who've been subjected to various kinds of violence, hasn't it?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
And you'll be contributing to a later event, I'm sure. I know, we know. Yes. Okay. So there's the question. Who wants to pick that up of our speakers?
Well, one of the things that I've paid a lot of attention to is under such circumstances is the prosecutorial map. The decisions basically decide whose movement is going to be controlled in what way, and to what extent juridical forces are going to be levied in various ways. When I did my work on war crimes, for example, I have a whole chapter in which I talk about the disjunctures between the map of enmities and friendships, the map of weapons exchanges, and then the prosecutorial map, which are quite disjunctive.
You want to say a little bit more about that, or?
Yeah. Well, what it does is it creates what we were talking about earlier, the terror, not knowing, for example, at what extent you're going to be vulnerable to what kind of activity. One of the best places, I think, to view that is the current Netflix series that is still on called Black Earth Rising, Hugo Blick's analysis, in which it becomes clear that no one is interested in justice because it's geopolitically inconvenient.
Heather, have you some like to share with us on?
Yeah, thank you, Sana. I appreciate your question. And I believe I'm excited about your presentation upcoming in this series. And I know you work in part with displacement and the idea of kind of displaced communities. And I have a little bit of work myself with refugee communities. I have a piece article about kind of the Syrian border and refugees and kind of fleeing. And so I'm very interested in your question. I think it's a very, very good one. And particularly if I heard you correctly, thinking about the idea of agency in terms of communities being impacted and affected by these types of violences, and researchers, right? Those of us that are sometimes embedded or within these communities. And I think that's a great question. So first of all, I think, at least in my work, part of the idea of kind of opening or widening the, our lens and thinking about what terror means, what maps mean, all of that is to think about people who are living within architectures of violence and landscapes of violence have always had agency, have agency, enact agency in ways that I think sometimes for me in my work, those maps don't account for, right? They often talk about them or write them as being enacted upon, as opposed to enacting themselves. So, for example, if in my Portland example, I think much of kind of hostile architecture assumes, houseless individuals need to be sort of interacted upon. They need to be moved out of spaces. They need to be pushed into other spaces. They need to be, right? And very little of that does what we might call sort of in political organizing, mutual aid, being in conversation with those individuals, or what we might call sort of theoretically, agentively understood, right? And so I think that I situate agency always, I hope, first and foremost, anthropologically with the communities of which I would be a part. Now, as a researcher, though, I think it's very critical to understand, like, we have agency as well, right? And so the ways that we write about, the ways that we understand, the ways that we insert ourselves. I mean, let's not forget that anthropologically, we still publish a great deal of work in that field where we call the people that we talk to informants. So, which it has a policing connotation, has a connotation born from war and violence and policing. And so I think your question is a really good one. I'm not sure I have an answer. Those are just some of my thoughts in terms of how I try to go about my work or think about my work. And I'm hopeful in my field, at least, to see more, and I think, the fields I do work in, to see more of what we try for in terms of crossing boundaries and barriers between the communities in which we work and the sort of researcher positionality, I guess.
Now, I think we have a very interesting comment that from Ian Chambers, who I think has actually written a book about territories and territoriality. I seem to remember, but is it Ian Chambers with us? Well, I'll read his question out anyway. I think it's probably from who I think it is, but anyway. So he says, the weaponizing of everyday life from the territory to the city has a wider and deeper history in the colonial constitution of the present. That too provides a map, in inverted commas, that navigates both the complexities of the details presented this evening and the shaping space-time of modernity and its colonial formation. So I'm sure it's the guy who wrote this book. Both yesterday and today, such a map also resonates with the violence of the unmappable. So that's, I think, a very substantial and substantive comment. And I suppose it does raise the question, which in different ways, Jeremy, Heather and Michael have raised about, well, first of all, the kind of rather Eurocentric models of cartography, which I think some of us have grown up, and certainly Livingmaps, we're critiquing that and then trying to move beyond them, both in terms of the people we're involved with and the work we do, and that kind of notion of cartographic rationality, and to what extent countermapping actually does break with it or not. So I think so the question really is whether we need to take a slightly wider angled perspective of this, both in terms of locating it within the legacy of colonialism, or the spectre of colonialism, if you want to be a bit Derrida about it, and how that is actually operating today in the kinds of maps that our contributors have been talking about. So, so can I ask our speakers first of all, and if there's other people who want to come in and contribute, then please do. But in the first instance,
I want to say something in response to Heather's interesting remarks about our responsibility as researchers. That is, I think the concept of the precarious life is really important here. And one of the dynamics that's taking place cartographically in Honolulu is we have a lot of homeless people who build temporary enclaves, and then they have to be attentive to the map of sweeps that are about to take place. And so there's this dialectic going on between building and deconstructing constantly. And the city planners are not particularly interested in protecting the homeless because they pose a hazard with respect to how welcoming the environment looks for tourism, which is our major industry. And so pointing out the precarious lives and what one can do with respect to it becomes important.
Can I be awkward? I always like being awkward. I think, I mean, it's understandable, but I think we're extrapolating a certain set of modern judgments onto the historical process. And history is multivalent, it's complex, it's contingent, and there is no one sense of modernity or modernization. That's just a construct. And the phrase or the suggestion that colonialization is the basis of modernity is ludicrous. That's taking an aspect of modern day culture or history wars and seeking to array all the past, or indeed the present or the future, in those terms. The reality is that the process by which we get to today changes all the time, that it changes in part depending upon which perspective you look at. And any attempt by any ideology, conservative or left-wing, secular or spiritual, to provide some comprehensive account is, in my view, facile. I think one needs to offer much more doubt in the use of terms, which is what I tried to do in my approach. And it's worth saying that for most of human history, we have no idea what people experienced. for most of human history, we have no idea what the basis was of action. We can try and extrapolate our senses because that makes it easier for us, but we're being very arrogant, all of us, if we assume we know the past. If you want to assume you know the present, that's up to you. If you think you know the present by reading books or literature, that's up to you. But I do not think that's a way of describing the past. Now, I have to accept that that is not the views that are implicit in what we've been listening to, but I'd like to hear a little bit more doubt and a little less certainty if people want to get history right. And I think we've got to be very careful. By all means, take part in a debate on the present, because we are essentially democrats and we would all believe that everybody has a valid viewpoint. But our viewpoints on the past are actually, in some respects, very conceited, because people in the past didn't think as far as we can tell like us. So we've got to be very, very careful. And we've got to be very careful of extrapolating our judgments on it. And, you know, to do it, and let's be blunt, most people in the past did not read books. Literacy in most societies was limited prior to 1800, in many societies prior to 1900, in many societies prior to 1950. So one's got to be very cautious about using literature from the past in order to give oneself a view on anything other than the authors of those works.
Well, the past certainly is a foreign country, whether people might feel, you know, how certainly cartography has contributed its own kind of ways of misreading that. So my favorite story about that is, I think it was I think it was Gary Spivak actually told this story, but anyway, he said, I think it was somebody from Ghana who said, but in the old days, we had the territory and you had the maps. Now we have your maps and you have our territory. So, I mean, you know, there's documenting that particular kind of exchange seems to me to be something which needs to be done, really, and needs to be done by the people who are actually experience that. Anyway, let's just maybe try and, well, raise the issue of whether we think mapping or counter mapping either actually makes those issues more or less interesting and complicated. And I don't know if any of our other speakers have any thoughts on that matter.
Well, let me just say briefly, beginning with a footnote. I wrote a book called Politics and Time, in which I deal a lot with the question that Augustine raised pretty simply: how can the past be if it's no longer? And what I focus especially on is the future imperfect grammar, the will have been. The past always will have been. How we have the past has to do with the grammars we decide with which to represent it.
Okay.
I would say perhaps I'll become the the provocative one. So I think I want to say I think there's a both and. In other words, I think there's two things that can be meaningful at the same time when we think about history. And perhaps this is my dual fields of thinking about communication, rhetorical studies, and anthropology working hand in hand. So while yes, I think that, you know, history in many ways, we impose many views on history. And I think particularly continental theory is rife with this problem. I particularly would point to Sana's comment in the chat, which is my experience as well, doing a great deal of work in the Middle East and North Africa, that we impose terms like modernity on regions which have really no corollary. So I think that's sort of meaningful, right? That the way knowledge is imposed on sort of, you know, again, I agree, so-called kind of global South, my work in places like Jordan, Saudi Arabia, other spaces. But that being said, I think a couple things are important. So I think Jeremy's comment, the idea that kind of the hubris of us kind of here speaking English, talking about, you know, the things that we're talking about and referring to theory we are, A few things are true. One, I'm here for giving the presentation in English because that's the sort of common language we're using. I could give it in any of the 7 languages I'm fluent in, not all of which are languages that derive from the European background, right? Not all of us that are researchers or that are doing this work are from European ancestries, including myself. Not all of us are from white ancestries, including myself, meaning some of us are sort of living actually as sort of speaking subjects that are not representing any particular, performance that the continental theory that we sometimes cite is the same performance of historically. So I think that probably is important. But even if we set all that aside, as Jeremy sort of wants to frame it, saying some people are religious, some people are not religious, all of that, then so be it. But I think then what may be true that is important is a couple other notes. One, literature is not all we have to understand the past. And this is where I would say we have some strong fields that have helped us understand that, right? My field, for example, has gone to great lengths to talk about historically. Aristotle didn't sit down and write on a scroll, and that's how we have Aristotelian texts. And that's a very Western example. We don't have fragments of Sappho because Sappho sat down and wrote literature, quote unquote, in the way we're understanding it. We can understand or grapple with, is what I'd prefer to say, pieces of history in ways that are not bound to the current ways now that we, impose knowledges on past histories. But it does require us to engage, I think, other ways of knowing, which is tremendously sort of time consuming and takes particular, research methodologies that we have to sometimes blend together. So I don't think, in other words, history is sort of lost to us and all is the present. I simultaneously don't think we can sort of speak the past into being. I think if we are to say that the past is completely lost to us, then there is a great deal that we cede about our understandings of what previous generations have worked a great deal to preserve. This is what in my field we call public memory. So if we think about in my country, in the United States, what people like a Martin Luther King or what people like an FDR went to great lengths to preserve in terms of struggle, so it could be handed down for future generations to understand. Those things would be lost if in a generation or 2 generations we were to sit on a call like this and say, well, we can't impose the way we sort of see it now on sort of the text of that moment. And so I guess I would suggest, I think it's both and I'm particularly reacting here to Jeremy's comment that colonization or colonialism, that it's absurd for us to think of that as the basis of modernity. I respect Jeremy's kind of positionality of that statement. At the same time, I think it's undeniable that colonialism has had very long-term and impactful effects on the shaping of the way boundaries, maps, modern day assemblages of human bodies and space are understood now, whether we look at kind of Michael's case study of thinking about Israel and thinking about Palestine, or whether we look at, the way that countries interact with one another now in the modern kind of warscape. And so I don't think that's sort of just a modern leftist pitch of kind of news media or theoryscape. I think that that's something that we would be remiss not to take seriously in terms of how we read many of the things that we're talking about today. So in other words, I think there's kind of maybe a both and that we could engage in thinking about many of the questions of terror's relationship to the map, to violence, and to those kind of larger questions.
Okay, well, it's coming up to 7:30, which is going to be our cutoff point. So we've only got a couple of more minutes. I think it's interesting the turn the conversation has taken. I suppose, well, in terms of the present, the contributions we've had this evening have made me think again about, for example, I read about what's happening in China. I don't speak Chinese. I don't really know that much about Chinese history or culture, but I can actually see certain things going on in some of the major cities in China, which are kind of intelligible to me. People who've been trapped in these tower blocks as a result of the Chinese Communist Party's policy towards COVID, and how people then have responded to that and taken up a series of issues about what it's like living under an authoritarian state and issues of space reclaiming a space, and a space also that would be a more democratic space, a commons even. So, I mean, I do think we have some equipment, some concepts to try and, I mean, it's obviously going to be an act of translation, and things are lost in translation. But I don't want to stop finding out about what's going on in China or what's going on in the Ukraine, because I'm not Ukrainian, because I don't speak Ukrainian.
I'll maybe only conclude by saying, and I appreciate the vibrancy of this conversation and the questions within. It just speaks to, I think, how important many of these larger issues are. And as someone who works in these regions, who's fluent in Arabic, fluent in Hebrew, has been in the archives in the region where Michael is doing the work of this presentation. My first book is sort of based in that region, who works around colonialism pretty extensively. And when I say in the archive, I mean both the archive that the state sort of has built, which it took me a couple of years to get in, but also what I consider the kind of anthropological archival work. I think Sana mentioned this a little earlier, but working in the communities of people that often aren't archived. In other words, people don't go into those, don't call those archives frequently. I guess I would just sort of levy a little bit what I said, point back to what I said earlier. I think it's possible for two things to be true at once. Can we sort of know all of history? I think, you know, Jeremy, okay, that has a fair point, that we can't know all of history. We can't know all the depths of history. But at the same time, there are particular arcs to history in the way that power functions around mapping, around institutions, around systems that have led to certain places where there are communities who have fared worse in the arc of that history than others. The Palestine-Israel case is a really strong one with which I'm deeply familiar. I'm also familiar with ones in the Middle East, North African sort of regions. So I'd point to the Syrian border, where the largest refugee camp in the world currently exists, where I've spent extensive time. I would point to the FIFA tournament that's going on right now in Qatar. That is an incredible example as well, the sort of, you know, Western sort of intrusion into that country and what that has meant and is meaning as we are on this call for the people of Qatar, when the West pulls out and those people will be left houseless with no way, you know, to earn back anything they've lost in that time. Those are going to remap the shape. And that is an arc of history, right, that we can go back and look at, whether you talk about the 1200s, 1500s, the 1700s. Does that mean the 1200s can be in the same conversation in terms of all of the discursive practices, military understandings and mappings? Are those the same as what we see in 2017? No, right? But I do think there are some substantial ways that that conversation does need to be one that takes into account both of those parts of the map in the 1200s, the 1700s, and 2022. And if it does not, then we risk missing a substantial part of the conversation that, you know, an organized panel like this is designed to address.
I would also say that, of course, there is also debates about indigenous cartographies and the extent to which people who are working with indigenous communities that are subject to land grabs and various kinds of violence, both from the state and from rogue capital, to what extent they should use digital mapping technologies. I mean, as a way of translating their own indigenous mapping practices into a form that the power, you know, the state and the wider player actors in the drama will actually accept, you know, because people have got these fixed ideas that, you know, a Google map is a real map, and the kinds of maps that indigenous communities make aren't real maps. So there is so that comes back into within cartography itself, and people do take different positions. I mean, people are, you know, it's like radical cartographers. Some say you should stick with it, you know, it's their maps. We should simply amplify, create more platforms for those maps to be shown and to be understood in their own terms. And there are others saying, well, no, if you really want to, including indigenous people themselves, saying, well, no, we want to use this mapping technology if it actually empowers us. And, you know, means that our kind of claims and stakes are actually recognized and legitimated. So, you know, there's
also a third way, and that is indigenous communities. Some people in them also claim the right to opacity. That is, they don't want their maps to be translated.
Yeah, absolutely, we don't want to be on the map. Absolutely, yeah. But anyway, this is a conversation we shall continue. you know, in other events and in other places as well. And it's certainly very central to what we're trying to do with Livingmaps Network. I'd like to thank all our contributors for their presentations. It's given us a lot of food for thought, and we've had a very robust debate, which I think is good, is what we should be doing. So thank you all for turning up, and again, especially for our three speakers, and to Jacob Wallach for you know, managing to put the whole thing together. So that's it for now. Our next event, I should just say, is on the, God, I can't remember what date is it, Jacob?
14th.
It's 14th of December.
Yeah.
It's called Behind the Lines, Frontline Mapping, So Spatial Technologies and Surveying the First World War Landscape by Keith Lilly, who's made actually an amazing research on this. And again, comes back to thinking about mental maps of war and their relationship to kind of military cartographies and so on. So I hope you'll join us for that. And once again, thank you all for turning up, and I hope you've enjoyed this evening.